Hello everybody, welcome to Foz do Iguaçu. And hi Fernando, thank you very much for inviting me to make this keynote speech for this session. Since I'm wearing the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change hat at this meeting, I'm gonna provide some of the elements in two of the recent special reports of the IPCC that bring relevant information to this meeting. The first of this report is the global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. This report was approved by the 195 member governments of the IPCC in October last year. And the most recently special report addresses climate change and land and was approved at the beginning of this month in Geneva. Both of these reports of the IPCC bring very, very strong messages. The global warming of 1.5 special report, for instance, one of the findings in this special report says that it's not impossible to limit global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. However, it's going to require unprecedented transformations, changes in all areas of the society. All pathways assessed by the IPCC reach net carbon dioxide emissions by around 2050. All of them also require some level of carbon dioxide removal measures or techniques. And particularly in the case of overshoot pathways, those pathways where the temperature exceeds 1.5 degrees Celsius before 2100, and then you have to try to bring it down to 1.5 degrees at the end. So there are several options under the umbrella of carbon dioxide removal. However, for the 1.5 degrees Celsius report, the assessed pathways relied mainly on afforestation and reforestation, and also bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, the BECCS, as they call it. The issue is that large-scale implementation of CDR measures can have impacts that are not yet known, especially if they are implemented at large scale. And these can have impacts on land, on food security, and on the local community at large. Also on biodiversity and water security. However, some of the CDR measures related to agriculture, forestry, and other land use can have important positive effects on land, on biodiversity, on the restoration of natural ecosystems. The need for negative emissions, and these are going to be necessary because most likely we are going to have residual CO2 emissions around 2050, because it's not possibly going to be a reality that all CO2 emissions will be zeroed or net zeroed by around 2050, and will need to be compensated with carbon dioxide removal techniques, which are the techniques that IPCC explored the most. Obviously, there are other techniques, like these the CDR were usually under the umbrella of geoengineering, which also included the solar radiation modification, as we call it now. But the level of scientific knowledge on the use of this modification, this solar radiation modification, is not yet known. So the IPCC just separated the geoengineering from CDR measures and the solar radiation modification measures as well. So, as I was saying, so the need for negative emissions to compensate these CO2 removals will most likely be very necessary, in particular for those overshoot pathways. And investments into these land-based CDR measures can contribute to halting or reversing land degradation, to the restoration or rehabilitation of degraded land and marginal lands. So land restoration is among the existing CDR measures, although the IPCC in its pathways has explored basically afforestation and reforestation, and as I mentioned, BECCS. The other special report, the special report on climate change and land, this report focused on, or has chapters on, desertification, land degradation, especially also on food security, and a very important chapter is the one that makes the interlinkages between the terrestrial fluxes, land degradation, desertification, food security, and climate change. And this reports being really important contributions from land-based activities, including those that fit into the CDR measures, as I have said. Obviously, within this land report, we have several activities. So we can talk about forest restoration as being cited in the report as being one of the key activities that can be taken within the CDR measures, and also bringing not only the restoration of the land, but also co-benefits, especially those related to mitigation and adaptation of climate change. Not only forest restoration, or the use of reforestation, afforestation, for the recovery of the degradation of the degraded land, but also the restoration of wetlands, restoration of peatlands, restoration of soils, that all of these can bring important contributions to mitigation and adaptation of climate change, which is really the focus of the report. Obviously, forest, using forests to recover or to restore the degraded land is the one that's considered to be the key in terms of the mitigation, but also has high costs and also possibly compete with other possibilities that are cheaper than using forests. It's still very unknown globally, the extent of land degradation globally. So, but it's well known that addressing these will be extremely important to help cope with limiting global warming at low levels of warming, so as to limit the potential impacts or to minimize the potential impacts on natural and in the ecosystems, in the natural ecosystems. So if I now take a little bit out my hat of IPCC and address a little bit on how Brazil is taking so seriously the restoration of degraded land, I see that in the notes that have been handed out for this meeting, we see they mentioned to the bond challenge, which obviously Brazil adhered, Brazil signed to it, with the commitment to restore approximately 12 million hectares by 2030. But we see that it's not only on the bond challenge. If we look at the national policy on climate change of Brazil, with its voluntary targets by 2020, we see that besides addressing reducing deforestation in Amazonia and the Cerrado quite significantly, by the way, we also see the restoration of degraded pastures in about 50 million hectares. And most recently, we saw in the nationally determined contribution of Brazil under the Paris Agreement, additional 50 million hectares of degraded land being restored. So we see the importance that is being assigned together with the reduction of deforestation, we bring very strongly the restoration of degraded land, most strongly the restoration of degraded pastures that can really contribute for Brazil achieving its commitments under the National Policy on Climate Change and also under the Paris Agreement commitment. So at this point, I would like really to thank all of you engaged in the Restore project, because I do find it extremely relevant to achieve the aims of restoration. And it has to start by, as you say, the identification of the appropriate places where this restoration could be carried out, the means by which it can be done, and the investments that will be necessary that could attract the attention of the private sector in particular, but not solely. So I see this as a compromise between all the stakeholders, where the civil society, private sector, business people, public sector, at all levels, state governments, everybody should be engaged into this initiative, because bringing them on board can make a really, really big and significant change. When I like to finalize, now bring my IPCC hat back in my head, I really like the messages that both the reports bring. I will start with the 1.5 messages, and the messages is that every action counts, every year of delay matters. So we shouldn't delay, we should start now if we really are aiming to limit global warming at a level that has the minimal impact. The land report brings other messages that says the importance of the land to provide food, feed, the means for life on Earth. But it also makes it very clear that land cannot do it all. So to really cope with climate change, we need to do more. But land has a huge contribution. And so, again, I would like to thank all of you engaged in the Restore, and wish all the best, and wish you a very, very productive and constructive meeting. Thank you very much.